Welcome back to the Lessons for Tomorrow podcast, the motivational poster in your ear. I'm your host, Tim Ahlenius, VP of Strategic Initiatives at americaneagle.com. In this episode, we're going to be diving into one of the favorite buzzwords of the past few years, composable. It's not headless, it's composable now. So we're going to unpack that more as we move forward. To discuss this, I'm joined by Chris Bach, Netlify, co-founder, CCO, CSO, and many more. So Chris, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about the company, and maybe a little bit about your past as well. What brought you to being a co-founder for Netlify?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Yes, I'm Chris Bach. I am a co-founder of Netlify. I also sit on the board of the Market Alliance. I have a number of angel investments, 30 plus, I think, in the composable category, you could say, right? Especially around developer tooling. I sit on a number of advisory boards as well. And yeah, spend most of my time, I would say, on composable architecture and the other sort of movements around this in this new decentralized web economy that sort of leads to it.
Wonderful. And for those who don't know, can you explain a little bit about the Mach Alliance and kind of how that was formed and the benefits of it?
Absolutely. So the Mach Alliance is an industry body really for composable architecture. And it comes in and helps and guides enterprises in how to engage when it comes to composable architecture. So it has quite strict certifications for its members on, are they actually composable? Is it microservices, cloud native? Is it headless? Does it use APIs? And it does so in the right way, right? Or is it more sort of a traditional legacy monolithic way, right? So it looks at, is it software as a service? Is it multi-tenant? It basically, on behalf of clients and enterprises, goes and looks a lot at the different vendors in this space and make sure both whether they're SIs or SMEs or enablers, that they sort of fit the bill and that enterprises can depend on them for being successful when it comes to implementing composable architecture.
Wonderful. Yeah. And we've worked with them as well. And it's, I think, great to see kind of that industry-wide approach to making sure that a technology evolution really of where composable has come from, those monolithic legacy systems, we'll talk about that past in a little bit, has really just been focused on how do we make sure that we, continue the evolution of that technology in the right direction and working together across the board there. I know
Absolutely.
A lot of partners have become members of the Mach Alliance and looking at that opportunity. So let's jump backwards a little bit and unpack what you mentioned when describing the Mach Alliance and kind of where it came from with the legacy side of things. What kind of was prior to composable and what caused the need for composable in your mind?
Well, absolutely. I mean, and this is also very much the origin story of Netlify.
Mm-hmm.
So around 10 years ago, we saw an opportunity to essentially, and what this all started with was decoupling the web.
Mm-hmm.
That means separating the front end from the back end. And we saw that my co-founder and I should say we're both from Copenhagen, Denmark, as a way of intro here. I do live in San Francisco, both of us do, and Netlify is over. Well, it's completely distributed today, right? But started over here. But what we saw, and before that, I should also mention that I spent 15 years in agencies, so I saw this very much from that side of things, right? And I think the web was threatened as a standard, right, by walled gardens and by issues of scalability and security. What we saw on mobile was that, no one thought it was a good idea to pull in the UI every time you turn a page, right? The basic architecture of the web. This is not whether you choose WordPress or Sitecore, Adobe Experience Manager, but the underlying architecture wasn't really fitting the need, right? And so we ended up with apps that are downloaded, right? And then when they execute it from the mobile phone's operating system, they'll talk to services, APIs, and so on, and pull in whatever information they need for real-time updating. We saw it on the infrastructure of things, right? Even in 2007, Jeff Bezos was out talking about 2 pizza teams and microservices and this idea of being able to be much more nimble. And for reasons of scale and security as well, right? You didn't want to work everyone on one big monolith, but rather slice out the different functions and standalone services. However, the web was still running on what we call traditional legacy monoliths, right? And all that really means is there's a big fat program running on a single server and trying to cater everything, right? And so when we talk a bit larger systems, traditional what we call digital experience platform or DXPs, which basically all large .coms are running on or used to run on, right? And it's functionality like content management and commerce and build tools and analytics and a lot of things pulled in. What it meant is that it sort of had to be exposed and it had to be running and it had to be building for every single visitor.
Yeah.
And that very often led to something that could be quite bloated and quite ungovernable, and really best in class at nothing. Because what happened at the same time was all our digital touch points really started growing, right? There became more and more of them. So this idea of being able to build natively for each one became more and more important. Also, we sort of collectively found out just how important omni-channel is, right, for most businesses.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
And we saw that especially in the e-commerce space. And as you mentioned, there's so many different tools and technologies that are there. And Scott Brinker, Chief Martech, puts out his marketing landscape. And I mean, he's not even doing it every year now, I believe, because of how just massive that list is now. But there's 10,000 plus different technologies and the different aspects of marketing technology that can be implemented into your digital experience. And that's where Composable really kind of needed to come out, because you had all these different choices and you had different maturity levels of those tools as well. The DXPs had maturity levels also, but at a certain point you would have to go to a third-party marketing tool to truly deliver the experience that you needed to. And all these systems needed to connect, but there was never a way that every time you did it, it was a custom integration. We built and built and built these over the years. And every time that someone came in, and we'll have to talk about CMOs in a future episode and the 18 to 24 month time frame that you have before they come in and bring all the technologies they want into the organization. But that constant switching is, I think, one of the best reasons for Composable, because it really started to bring, and I use this word lightly and in air quotes for those who don't see me, an ease ability for switching to a new technology solution.
Exactly. And so back to when we started there, right? We saw proof in the pudding that this decoupling would make sense. And we saw that if we would decouple the front end, that is, in other words, that's the UI, that's the web experience layer, that's the presentation, that's what you're going to interact with on a screen, whether it's an iPad, a mobile, or a fitness bike, or your laptop, right? You separate that from the backend needs. It seemed like a technicality, but it would lead to so much, right? It could potentially unleash a lot of potential. And so one was that instead of having that one server, which is a single point of origin, which is a very big traditional bottleneck, you could now pre-build things and distribute it so you would have multiple points of origin. So that made it a lot more fast and a lot more scalable. And we all know that faster load times gives higher conversion, right? At the same time, the build tool, the build image in itself, what would run, right? That would now happen on your developer's computer rather than being exposed for everyone, right? So it was a lot more secure by default. But then the next layer here was really that it would enable this hugely growing section, which is web developers, right? Now, front-end developers, they used to cut up Photoshop files and turn them into HTML. That was the actual job, right? Then you send it off for implementation somewhere. Now, when we started Netlify, they were already starting to use frameworks like JavaScript frameworks like Angular, and they were doing advanced applications, but they were still left to hand it over for implementation. And anyone that's worked on the agency side knows that, or marketing, I would assume, right, knows that that's where deadlines go to die, right? Like you have control of it, you'll build out the site, but as soon as it has to go for implementation, like DevOps and system administrators, they will come back in a few months if you're lucky, and it's not going to look what you gave to them because it had been implemented and fit the templates and so on, right? Now, in this world, because it was decoupled, it would just pull that data from the backend as APIs, right? That is super powerful because now when you push, you're live, right? And that meant so much for time to market, right? And so much for I would say developer velocity of those marketing departments trying to publish. So there was a lot to be said for that. But then lastly, it would pave the way to composable architecture. And there's so many different variations of defining this, right? But a really basic one I find is just think of it this way, right? Where before, your commerce solution, well, what was the output of that? Well, it was often a website, right? Now, the same was for your content management solutions, but you only have one .com. So if each of these functions output a website, you have to choose to use one of them, right? But if they're all APIs and they're all headless, right, and you can all pull from them as data sources, well, That's composable, right? Now you can mix and match those different ones, right? They don't have to be from the same vendor, all of it. You can change one without having to change all the others. But in order for that, you actually needed that decoupled architecture to really work first, right? And so at the end of the day, we saw there's so much potential here, but two things are needed. First, an ecosystem. It's very simple. There's no headless commerce without a headless commerce provider, right? If all the commerce providers are only providing it as monoliths, right? Then there's nothing to really come for. And secondly, it would need what you were talking about before as well, right? A viable workflow. So once you got these monoliths, once they just do what they do well, let's say manage content, right? But they're no longer giving you that release management, right? And or compiling things. And there's what about hosting and how do you deal with all those different kinds of things, right? And and all the different infrastructure that goes into it to coming live. If you could create a platform that could just tie all those things together, and then by the Git workflows that the companies have already chosen, just automated everything from there. Really a new way of thinking. It's not about choosing a hosting provider. It's about abstracting the need away. In this world, you're not setting caching headers. There isn't huge teams having to deal with infrastructure and SQL injections and all those things that can actually be abstracted away. Then that would be a very powerful play, right? And it would also be needed because back then, the only things built this way were blocks, right? And so we started out basically betting everything on a market trend that didn't exist. And then fast forward to today, I would say where there was 2 or 3 companies back then, there's more than 2,500 today. Netlify alone has more than 4 million businesses and developers on the platform. We had, I think, more than 115,000 every month. And we're really seeing how this is taking off extremely rapidly, right? Gartner was out talking about 12% of enterprises said they would build composably in 2020. If they were building new, right? But then you take the life cycle of 7 to 10 years for one of those DXPs, and it's actually much less. The number was 23% in 2021, 70% in 2022. But this year they're saying that 70% of all enterprises will be building with composable architecture. And that goes to show to me that this is the biggest shift we've had since on-prem to cloud. Right? This is a huge movement. And so for Netlify, we really sort of went out there and pioneered the front-end cloud. So if you think of how you work together with deploy previews and serverless Vikit, all those things are sort of industry standards we pushed out there. Now we're also seeing a new audience, right? And an audience in enterprises that are saying, well, it's not about just optimizing for a new system. It's more about how can we bring modern workflows that works equally well with our legacy systems or existing systems, right? To use a nicer word, right? Which can still have a ton of fantastic functionality and composable architecture. And how do you provide unified release management for both of them, right? How do you provide that next level of orchestration you need as an enterprise architect? And so that's really what Netlify is focusing on today, making not just developers, but companies successful. So we're still providing the plumbing, right? And we're still providing what you need to be successful in choosing the best-in-class components and then tying them together.
No, absolutely. And I think with all of that too, Chris, what I love the stats, right? And this is a big key thing that I want to make sure that we hit on for our listeners is that acceleration and that jump in numbers that Chris just ran us through with the number of organizations moving into the composable architecture space was also greatly impacted, especially in the B2B organizations because of the pandemic. And that forced them to take a digital transformation process that typically was a 7 to 10 year, and they were forced to figure out a way to survive without physical presence, with all the logistics issues that were happening. So in a way, it actually took a common life cycle of some of the different platforms and technologies that an organization had internally and said, whoa, wait, we have to adjust now and pivot faster than we're used to. And so many of the CTOs and CIOs and CMOs that I've talked to, and especially more on the infrastructure side, were accelerated by this fact because they had to figure out different ways to handle inventory, shipping, pickup. All of that came into play. And I think one thing that I love, and even though Netlify isn't a e-commerce provider, I love your tagline on your homepage of your website of "We ship the future faster," and it's so true because the way that you can utilize Composable to be faster in an implementation of a technology solution for the digital transformation that's happening there. And digital transformation, I know, is a word that everyone is like, oh, it's a buzzword, but guess what? It's never done. And that's one thing I think that a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that, oh, I'm going to go through a digital transformation and I'll have an endpoint.
Yep.
You won't, because something new will change in that technology platform. Maybe that technology platform is end of lifed. We see all sorts of companies do this. Google just did that with their A/B testing tool, Google Optimize, announced end of life for September. They forced a huge transformation for people with the Google Analytics switch over to GA4 from UA. It's brought a whole new aspect to people of what they have to do. The same happens across the board. So if you have that composable architecture in place, and you don't have to put everything into it right away. That's the beauty of it. You can start to build a composable architecture infrastructure and slowly move pieces of your organization over into it as appropriate.
Exactly, right. And I think you hit on so many right things here, but like that we absolutely saw the same, right? I remember speaking to lots of companies that said, well, we had that e-commerce project, but it was exploratory and it was like Q3 2024, right?
Yeah.
And this is in 2020. It's not exploratory anymore, right? This is top of the agenda. And it went along, as you said, it's not about saying, hey, I need a new storefront, right? It's about saying, hey, we had 2,000 outlet, now we have one and it's online. And how do we cater that, right? And being holistic and looking at everything from your PIM to your transactional layer and how it all works together. So that is very much something we saw as well, right? And I would say if you looked at the scene, and I'm talking from an ISV vendor point of view of e-commerce, headless commerce in 2020, there was still just a handful of providers.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And now there's hundreds and hundreds, like everyone has come this way, right? Because they saw something that needed catering. And that's wonderful because that also means that everyone is out there pushing each other to next level. How we do e-commerce tremendously these days.
Well, and the impact that it had on the consumer experience, I think is critical because that forced an improvement in the technology solutions that are being used. I look at the BOPIS, buy online, pick up in store, or you've got buy online, pick up curbside now, where you had so many more people still driving to a physical location. But, oh, wait, the convenience of me not even having to go into the store? Oh, that's excellent. Yep. And it's continued since. After some of the things were restrictions removed, et cetera, you think people would maybe not do that as much. I still see it used a lot. The big thing that I think that happened also was on the marketing side. And this comes into that, again, the engagement that you have and the messaging that you provide and the importance of having your tools integrated together very seamlessly was in the messaging as well, because we saw brands losing the loyalty that had been built up over years because of incorrect messaging. I've talked about that on the show in the past, and a couch buying experience. I won't go in depth again here. Past episodes you can listen to, but basically the messaging was just so poorly done that I was just like, why am I going to continue to wait when they keep delaying and they don't tell me that it's a true long delay? Now, they fortunately still received my purchase from a clearance outlet that I was able to go visit in person. So the same manufacturer still received revenue from me. But overall, it was more tell me the truth. What's the messaging? But also know, hey, this is my third time back to the site looking at other couches after I've already purchased one. It hasn't been delivered. Hey, there's something there that you could have between your systems with a composable architecture, the data flowing to give me a great consumer experience, customer experience overall. So, Chris, what are some of the main reasons that organizations should consider composable and are integrating it into their solutions today?
Well, I think there's a lot of them, but the main reasons that we see again and again, I think number one has to be faster time to market, right? Pure velocity. Like this idea that you have to hand things over to DevOps and system administrators and wait a few months to hopefully get an answer and so on. It just doesn't fly anymore, right? And so I think that adaptability and being able to react quickly and move fast and experiment, which also needs fast time to market for that to actually fly. That's really needed, right? Number two I see is flexibility. So flexibility is more than one thing, right? Here it both means the idea that I can say, hey, I don't need to change everything if I want to just change this part, right? But I can swap it out. But it also means a lot for what I'm sure you sit every day and talk to your clients around, which is brand differentiation, right? I think today, especially when it comes to e-commerce, there's just so many vendors out there that if you're locked in by whatever templates that lies underneath the service provided by your DXP or monolith, and you can only build within those frameworks, that very often won't give you the necessary brand differentiation. But if you can build completely freely and create that digital touch points that looks and feels exactly the way you want it, right? Independent on the back end, then I think that gives you a lot of freedom, right? And we see that again and again, that part of the result there is the ability to really stand out. So I think flexibility is a big one. Speed is a big one as well. So this is an easy one, right? Like the faster site loads, the higher conversion rates you have. The reality is that if you do composable architecture right, then you can have multiple points of origin for the end results for those digital touch points, and you have to run code and execute code a lot less per visitor. So if you're trying to build everything from a monolith, then you're just going to have less of that flexibility. So even if you have the monolith and you can cache some of the things like media files on a CDN, the origin you still need a round trip to the origin. And the reality just is that your time to first byte is going to be slower. So if you do composable right by default, you get it faster, right? Without a large operational overhead. It's not a result of tons of engineers setting just the right caching. It's just you get it by pushing it live, right? So speed is a big one. And then omnichannel, right? I think omnichannel, and there's lots of surveys out there by Target and Macy's and Albertsons and so on, right? That shows recently how omnichannel customers are likely to shop 400% more than store-only customers. So there's all the incentive in the world to meet clients and customers more than one place, but in as many touch points as possible. And if you don't have the flexibility of building natively for those touch points, right? If you have that one solution that tries to cater everything, that's very hard to do, essentially, right? And so omnichannel is really favored by composable architecture because you can build really well for each touch point, right? There's also scalability and security. I think we talked about those earlier on, right? But composable architecture is much more, I would say, secure by default, because your APIs and microservices have smaller service areas of attacks than a monolith usually has. And a lot of this goes on in the development phase and the build phase, which is not live, but happening in a built environment that's separated from that domain that goes live. So there's a lot of these, right? And there's more, right? But for the sake of time, I think like these are some of the big ones. And this is primary reasons for enterprises to adopt composable architecture. But there's also what's in it for the end user, right?
Yeah, let's talk about them and how does it benefit them? I mean, you talked about the speed and everything from the organization's perspective of deployments and the speed of that site because of the impact on transactions. And you mentioned omni-channel, which I think is key because there's so much that happens now with mobile phone in everyone's pocket. There's so much price comparison shopping. There's a lot of different stats out there about it, but a lot of people in that omni-channel experience, right? If you're in a physical store, you might be price comparison shopping right then and there and saying, hey, I'm in the store, but can I get it cheaper? And it's amazing that for $1 or $2, people will actually, it's in front of them. But they'll actually buy online through that mobile device. So performance and speed come in critically there because you're in a moment to potentially take that away from a competitor, that transaction, or it could still be from your own site that you're benefiting. And maybe it was something in clearance or somewhere else, but they're finding that and they're having that omni-channel experience. But it happens across the board everywhere. Someone sees something as they're, I just had this, we were in St. Louis for a soccer tournament for my oldest for travel soccer this past weekend. And there was something really cool. I was like, oh, we want to go do that event and let's go buy a ticket online. And I immediately hopped on and the purchase experience was extremely fast. So guess what? They got my transaction right away. Different venue that I looked at, the purchase experience was horrible. It was slow. It was a clunky user interface. So that's where I think Composable benefits the delivery side of that. But for the consumer experience, what all does it provide?
Yeah, I think for this, it benefits of a lot of the same reasons. So I'm sure a lot of your clients do surveys on how satisfactory was your digital experience with us today. And one thing that always tops out, right, is speed.
Yeah.
Right. It leads to a negative result, right, where them being really unhappy with the experience if it's too slow. And if it's really fast, it makes them a lot happier, right? So it actually means something for our sentiment towards the company, right? Besides the known fact that I'm much more likely to bounce if you add 3 seconds in my initial time to first byte, right? There's like a 50% chance that I'm gone, right? So I think speed really, really matters for that reason. Another reason is, as we talked about earlier, before the monolith couldn't cater an app on a bike, right? Versus developer documentation versus a .com with all the enterprise stakeholders. So they were siloed solutions, right? And so the experience between the different solutions is going to have less in common. It's going to feel less coherent, and you're very often likely to drop data. For example, let's say you have a car configurator, right? And you sit and fill that in, and now you go to the point of sale, and then you have to do it all over again because nothing was saved and nothing is usable. And those systems are completely unrelated, right? Because of the nature of what else it had to support, defined that they couldn't support both experiences. In a composable world, that would be much easier data exchange, right? And so I think that for the user, you get a lot of benefits from a much more cohesive experience in your total interactions with that company. So I think those are two of them, right? And then there's the obvious ones of no one likes to go and visit something that's suffering from a /dot effect, as we used to call it, right? Basically, you get a lot of 502s because too many users try to hit up the same place at the same time, right? In composable architecture, because of the nature of it being decoupled, if you apply the right architecture, as we talked about, that means that you have better reliability and uptime, right? And so you might, for example, let's say you're buying a ticket, so that API might have some limits and some rate limits, right? But you still have a much better experience on the site as such because it's independently loaded from that ticket sale. Whereas in a monolith, those two are the same. So you're not getting anything. You don't know if you're your connection or anything else. In this case, you have a finished website. You're in there. You know where you are, right? And you know it's because, okay, I'm trying to get a ticket, and so is a lot of other people at the same time. So that still leads to a market better experience.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. I want to kind of go back and I'm going to backtrack a little bit. When we talk about the Netlify platform, maybe just go a little bit into depth of how someone kind of gets started into it. It's a little bit more, it's from a developer perspective initially, but it benefits the organization with the whole composable approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And actually, a good starting point for that is what you mentioned earlier, right? Which is this idea. And it's still my favorite value add of composable architecture, is the ability to gradually migrate. We all come from these lift and shifts, right? You have a monolith, you pick a new one, you port all the content, you feature lock, and then 18 months later, you're live on dated software, right? And 40% of your IT budget goes on upgrades that you get nothing in return for, right? And today we're seeing, we have large clients that we just have one, right? They had a checkout that had $1.5 billion in revenue, right? And so they just isolated the actual checkout page, customized it because now it was not tied by the internal backend systems, right? And they only sort of looked at anything that touched the actual checkout at that point, right? And then they were able to boost conversions by 7%, which is obviously meaningful, right? When you're looking at that kind of revenue, right? And in the old world, that's not how you would go about those things, right? That would have been completely integrated into a monolith, and you would adapt the whole thing in order for that to work, right? And now they were able to slice something out and get started, and that mimics very well how Netlify is often used, right? So it starts by being a place where you can go in and you can click a button and literally in 30 seconds live, let's say 30 seconds later, you can have something that's live and has global performance, right?
Yeah,
something that was like, not even if you paid for it, you can get that 10 years ago, unless you were Facebook or Google, right? And then it goes from there, right? And so today we have very large organizations using us across what usually be very silos, right? So, for example, we have one client. They sell a lot of exercise equipment, fitness bikes, and so guess who that is. But they have, if you look at the traditional grouping of digital touch points, then you would have, let's say, developer documentation, right?
Yeah.
Then you have one-off marketing sites. Then you have your .com, right? Lots of enterprise stakeholders, and you have commerce, and it integrates into Salesforce, HubSpot, you name it, right? Then you have the app on a bike, right?
Yeah.
Someone's yelling at you to bike faster, and you're like, why am I paying you for that, right?
Yep.
And but the reality is that in the old world, they're completely siloed. Like you ask, the marketing team, where's the app on the bike? They're probably making the factory, right? Yeah. But why shouldn't they share components? Why shouldn't that be the same UI? Why should they use serverless in different ways, right? But why couldn't that be a web app, right? And so all of that today runs with Netlify. Yeah. But it was a very sort of step function, right? It was started with someone using blogs, right? And then, they were making blogs, right? Like on a personal Gmail. They bring it to work. So do some of their other colleagues, very developer driven. And then they start using it for more. We start engaging. They need SLAs, and we build out sort of a good enterprise platform for them that they can just keep scaling on it. And it took years. Today, I would say that's very much supplemented by, as we cross the chasm, by a new type of user, which is not necessarily, I think what developers very much care about, especially early adopters, is technology. Yeah. And I think we're now moving into a place where the buyers can be marketers, they can be enterprise architects, digital directors. They're very often people that don't care as much about technology, but they care about the use cases and they care about business outcomes. Yeah. And I also think that that's us early players in composable architecture. That's something where in the beginning we were differentiating on technology, and that's what we sold and featured and highlighted, right? And then I think we went through a phase where it was more about features, and I saw this in the landscape as well, right? And with Bach and so on. And I think now we're sort of collectively finding out as we mature, this is about business outcomes, right? And we have to support them. And that's how we should think about it. Also, when we look at the product roadmaps and how we best engage with clients and SIs. So I think there's definitely a way to evolve this, right? I like that we have that path to success in 30 seconds. Like it's so easy to get something live, right? But of course, when we're talking to very large enterprise that are bringing over everything here, like if we're working with some of the very large fast-moving consumer good organizations that are using us, not just for the composable architecture, but now also to sit in front of everything they had before, right? And I think that's not done in a day. That requires understanding all the needs of the stakeholders. It requires change management. It requires, revisiting how you do your operations and a bunch of other things. But I think there's a lot of efficiencies to be had from it, but it just takes a while, right? Yeah. But so today, what Netlify really does is it abstracts away the traditional things we've looked at when we talk about hosting and operations, right? Because even though it's still hosted technically, what associated with that is things like, and it'll be technical fuzzing, but setting varnish caching and using different edge providers to set up very concrete, like complex rule sets that are governed by infrastructure engineers. This is not just done to go live. This is done continuously. And you do a lot of things. It has a large operational overhead. But in this new world and by our architecture, all of this is defaulted, right? Like it's abstracted away. That infrastructure becomes code. And I know to some people, what does that mean? It goes from operations to code. Yeah. But what it really means is just lies in that web developer's repo when they upload it. It gives everyone a common source of truth. Yeah. And it really saves a ton of hours. Yeah. So those hours on operations now just go straight to development of functionality, APIs, new features, websites, and so on. So I think that's a big part of what Netlify does, is really provide that no ops platform. The next part is this idea of developer orchestration. So when you have all those different components, it becomes really important, as we've seen over the last 10 years, that you have some sort of universal release management. Yes. And what it means is basically...
If only everyone could be on it right away.
Right? Exactly. Right? You need some way of saying all these components need to be treated in a way where they're aware of the other parts of the stack.
Mhm.
It needs to be folded in a very easy, automated way where you can build something and it pulls in the right data in the right way. And it exports something that automatically is distributed all over the world, right? That universal release management simply becomes really important. And I think of it in this way, right? Because it's not just a Netlify thing. It's as we went from on-prem to cloud, what we really did was two things. There was two reasons for doing this. One was scalability, right? Amazon can spin up more EC2 servers than you can. And the other was multitude of services. But it was operations as usual, right? So we still had all those things that we had to sort of orchestrate and set up and operate, right? There was a huge overhead for that. That was the digital part of our business, was mainly that. But back then, an average enterprise had maybe 50 services that had to orchestrate. Now it's more than 1,000, right? You add composable architecture with best-in-class components for each project on top of that, it is no longer tenable. So it stops being about how can we optimize for, just like the old monoliths where you had 400 startups a year coming out, sort of trying to find ways to patch security holes, right? What about removing the surface area of attack altogether? In the same way here, instead of using all that overhead of optimizing and scaling that operational part to just try to halfway keep up, look at ways you can automate your way out of it, right? And I see this emergence of a new cloud layer that's a workflow cloud that Netlify is an early example of that sits on top of this. Netlify, we sit in AWS Marketplace and so on, right? And count up against committed spend. We don't provide the infrastructure, but we write this intelligence layer on top of it that abstracts the need away for that, right?
And Chris, you used a keyword there. This is an intelligence layer that has already been thought through, optimized, and continually optimized for you so that your developers can focus on what they need to deliver and your organization is delivering through. But that intelligence layer is that extra, element on top of that is providing both a speed to market, which is critical in today's world, performance. You've got all the technical things that we won't go into, but the performance aspect of utilizing this approach too is critical because you mentioned it, right? It's speed to transaction. It's speed for search engine optimization with how Google evaluates you. Mobile devices are where everyone's experience starts or is continually on now for a large number of audience segments. And so that intelligence layer is one of the key things I want everyone to really take away here is that thinking's been done already for you.
Yes, and absolutely. And I think it's very important, as you say that, I'm reminded to really highlight, this is not about managed hosting. Because some might think, well, it's an outside agency taking care of this for me. No, it's about abstracting it away, right? So for example, I just recently spoke to a very large financial institution, right? And they have, of course, their .com, but then as you talk about it, they're in different countries, they have campaign sites, they have language variations, they may have 1,200 domains. Each of those have traditional staging environments and development environments, right? So there's 3,600 properties, right? The overhead that goes into securing it, because it is securable. You can even say some of it is secure by design, but it's not secure by default. So there's a lot of overhead there. And then you ask them, so how many of your sites are really optimized for speed, production, with managed caching, all the best practices and all the infrastructure? It's 5 of them, right? And why? Because it's expensive and it carries a lot of overhead. So this is from a very big financial organization, like multi-billion-dollar, and that just goes to prove the point, right? You need to think about this in ways where it doesn't exist anymore, like where it's the architecture. So when the irony is when someone, an intern pushes that site live at Netlify in 30 seconds flat, it has better performance or equal performance to those sites that have so much operational overhead in order to just get there, right? So it's not because you can't do it with your technical legacy stack, but it's not there by default. And we're getting to the point where the operational overhead is too big, right? So a huge part of the composable revolution, and what we often talk about in the Market Alliance, is the right components coming out, right? And of course, what I sit with as well is that, composable architecture is about choosing the right composable components. But if you don't apply composable architecture with it, then as you're talking about, you don't get that time to market, right? You don't get that increase in speed there, right? On Netlify, our enterprises on average push to production 25 times a day.
Wow.
on average, before they become clients, it's less than once a week.
Yeah.
So it's a huge speed increase. And it's not because we just have a better CDCI tool. It's because how everything is orchestrated. It's about all that operation that can have a common source of truth that's code.
Yeah.
It's only because of that, because the way you do secure it and a bunch of other things can be revamped as well alongside it, that you actually are able to push live that fast.
So would it be fair to say, just trying to use an analogy here, when we think about the fact that we have kind of one workflow, one platform, you're able as a developer to take and combine your different favorite tools or APIs and build these high performance sites, stores, and apps.
Yeah.
We really went from a model of where prior to what Netlify serves the purpose of, more of a toolbox. You put everything in and you'd eventually get them all connected, or you'd find the right tool. Now it's much more of like a tool belt where every tool has its spot and it's performance driven. So you know exactly where it is, how it's going to function, and you've kind of organized it in that sense, versus just a toolbox where everything goes in and you go and you can find it, but it takes a little bit of effort.
Absolutely. I think when we started thinking about this, we thought, okay, a primary value add of composable architecture is interoperability, right? It's the idea that, hey, if I need a new analytics tool, I don't have to change my entire marketing cloud with all the different software in it, right? But where do you have to lean in, right? Because if we do everything vanilla and we don't use JavaScript frameworks either and so on, right, then we also have to put in a lot of extra effort, right? And so I think you have to look at, where is the iteration extremely high, for example, on front end, right, where things can come and go quickly, and where do you have where can you expect to have long staying power? ERPs, for example, is not something you change every year, right? But as we looked at this holistically, what we saw was that you get swappability, but you need orchestration. And so in Netlify, we chose to say, that's it. Like, we don't provide you the database or the e-commerce solution or backend or the build tool, because they can be interchangeable, but we provide the plumbing that ties it all together, right?
And we appreciate that. There's far too many tools and platforms out there and solutions that try to be it all. And then, to your point, it's just too vanilla and you end up not getting what you need. I always call it, well, it's great that a DXP has certain tools, but at a certain point, you're going to mature out of those tools, because they'll never build the same maturity as someone focused on it. But when you stay focused in that area, you can truly deliver something amazing.
Yes. And then I think that there's another step in the maturity of composable architecture that we haven't touched upon yet, right? Which is that we used to come from, we talked a little bit about how it came from developer bottom up and they were technology focused, and now we sort of have a different entry point in many cases. But I think besides that, what we're also seeing is that before it's very project-based only. So we were optimizing for that specific .com. Very often even to sort of like, hey, with the output as a website. And that's it, right? But now I'm seeing more and more organizations that are optimizing for, how do I make this my digital strategy? Like, how do I do composable architecture at scale? And so now there's a bunch of new problems you're solving for, right? Because you're not just optimizing for finding that tool that fits that website. You're talking about, the reality is, you know what? I'm going to have a DXP, and I'm not going to migrate off it totally. Or if I am, it's going to take me years. And then I have this department really wanted this composable and headless CMS. These people over here, because it was written in something else, it just catered the needs, or we just had more experience with something else, we chose something else, right? And so you very quickly in organizations at any sort of scale with any sort of legacy ends up saying, well, we don't have one tool, we have many, right? And I don't mean just one tool, I mean one tool that does one thing, right? Like we'll have a lot of overlap. So the question then becomes, how am I successful in that? It can't just be a free for all. And that's really what Netlify's focus is as well. Like, how do we provide a common orchestration that can provide unified release management, a headless experience for your digital touch points, and all the orchestration that goes into it, but across those legacy solutions and the new composable architecture solution. And I think that's really, really interesting, right? And then I think the last part of this journey is also the agency leg here, right? Because I think that's super interesting, right? Of course, it's very close to heart for me because I spent 15 years in agencies, and what I see is that what I did and what most of my contemporary peers did at that point were, and I'm going to be a little rude, but we sold slogans, right? We were much more sort of selling communication and strategy, but now we had to adapt, or agencies had to adapt, because today most business problems have digital solutions, right? And so in that, I've seen agencies become SIs, if you want, or solution architects, right? And I think they're not just resellers in that. They're not even just enablers, though they're technical advisors to the point that they are software creators. So I think when we go into these organizations that are not building this in a self-architected way, bottom up over 4 years, but are saying, hey, I'm looking to adopt composable architectures at some scale, right? I think that relationship between tech vendors and SIs coming in as full partners, really, right? And saying, well, the SI comes in, their first tier support, the single throat to choke, right? They have the overall reference architecture that ties things together, right? But that has really called for us to redefine how we do partnerships with SIs, right? Because it has to be fundamentally different. If you just treat it as like a reseller agreement or something like that, where it's sort of like, hey, we list each other on partnership pages and see if we can drum up some joint business, it's not going to be enough, right? The reality is that the crux of composable architecture is that it's multiple vendors, right? It is pieced together. And so how do you piece that together, right? You need the right orchestration. We talked about that already, right? You need the right components, but you sure as anything really also need that right implementation, right? And as we talked about, it's not a one-off. But it's not just one thing. It has to fit into that overall digital strategy. And we talked about gradual migrations. That's great, but where do you start? And so I'd love to hear your take on this, right? Because for my chair, I'm really seeing that tech vendor / agency partnership has been very, very upgraded, right? We do common retros and hackathons, and I really see them as I see you as, I would almost say, an extension of what we do. Right?
Absolutely. I think that's, Chris, you're, one, I love how you broke it out for both the benefit for the organization. We talked about the benefit for the consumer multiple times, the end user of it, whatever role they may play, because we also haven't really hit on the app side, but the internal employee impact that composable can have. So even just internally for your organization, the benefit of a composable architecture, just as much as the outward external facing for any customers or consumers. But then to your point about the agency side and the SIs, and I think this is where at americaneagle.com, we have a unique perspective, because we started much more as an SI and worked into an agency, because we had our own CMS platform before all the main CMSs came out, and then they converted to DXPs. So we started in that development integration focus from day one, and we were purely websites and then apps as they came out and everything with the iPhone in 07 and whatnot, and the growth from there. But then we started adding in the agency side and even the strategy and the role that I started playing, 14 years ago when I first started here, right? And we started to build up a strategy division, and then we built up a digital marketing division. We kind of left that to other agencies for a while. Then we started to see the benefit of the way that the tools and platforms allowed us to bring that into the expertise, but also the desire from our clients and the partnerships we would create with them, where they look to us to be that holistic digital strategy mindset for them, because we're in the technology day in, day out. They need to focus on executing their business, and they need to understand the technology to a point. But we started to fulfill much more of that strategic, I'll use the word guidance counselor, but we really were helping guide them through, here's where you go next. And the platforms and Composable really aided us. And that did shift the mindset that we had, because now when I talk about, before, it used to be, all right, well, you're on this platform, you're based on this programming language, so here's going to be the best marketing platform to integrate with you for the way that they're based on the similar, their APIs can be worked in, or you'd work through this big middleware opportunity. But now you're building something that anytime that you change that, or that API even had a change, you had to restructure, right? As code deprecated, and you had to make changes overall for good reason, but it impacted so much more than what Composable allows you to keep in more of these smaller level changes that can be controlled.
Yeah.
And that to me as an agency was huge because to your point earlier, well, all right, we got to re-platform the DXP. Well, we're going to plan that project out. We're going to start it here on this day. By the time we get through all the implementation work, all the content migration, which is one of the biggest roadblocks we see in any project, you are almost a year past when you first started. And yes, there's upgrades that you can have to those DXPs, but those are not just small upgrades. Usually that constitutes changing the templates up or changing other implementations because they changed the way that certain coding was done. And so you're refactoring and you're basically, in a sense, rebuilding each time. And it's an upgrade, but you have to be careful because if you customize anything for your internal business needs, and this is one of the things I love about Composable, we always like to make sure that we are building to what the business needs and not fitting the business into a technology. Because at the end of the day, why should you change the way that you need to do business to fit a technology? You should be able to find the opportunity to have that technology aid you in doing your business. That's kind of the mantra we've had.
Yeah.
So Composable to us has been a great approach. We've had several implementations where we've brought e-commerce in to a DXP and using more of the headless approach, but because the commerce solution had the pieces that were needed, but then the DXP had the pieces for the content side. So we let both teams, e-commerce and marketing, get what they needed to do their jobs, but we weren't forced into one choice only, and this is all that you get.
Right.
So yeah, as an SI, as an agency, and then especially with all the digital marketing tools, it's great to be able to go in and say, hey, you know what? Yeah, we have experts in these different tools. If you change that tool from HubSpot CRM to Salesforce CRM, we understand how to connect them because it's an opportunity now in the way that we can build those out. But yeah, it's incredible the impact that it's had overall and the approach that you go into moving forward.
Right. No,
So,
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I appreciate the share on how the digital landscape today is so complex that the businesses can't be expected to wrap around all of it. Right?
Yeah.
So they have to lean on partners that do just that, right?
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
And there's never a one size fits all. If that's the one thing that I think that I talk about the most, it's find the ones and the technology and tools that will benefit you as a business the most to reach your employees, to reach your end consumers, whoever it is. There's more than enough out there.
Yeah.
And so find the one that's right for you and has a little bit of room for growth. But don't worry about this big long-term growth anymore because we're not locked in with tools that are changing every few years.
Right.
They're changing every few months at this point and the speed that we have. I mean, look at ChatGPT and the impact that that's going to have in the whole marketplace. And I'm not going to get us into that. That'll take us into a two-parter episode here. But Chris, I love what we're talking about. I want to end with my question about the future here and just looking at all the things we've talked about, how composables come and kind of taken and blown away the monoliths that are out there, and people are still converting over from those, which is great. And you can do that in a phased approach and scale it to what your needs are, which is great. Grow into it. Don't feel like you have to do it all at once. It's not worth trying to eat an elephant all at one time. It's one bite at a time. Same with replacing those internal systems with digital transformation. But in the future, let's just call it 3 years down the road, Composable still there, Composable evolved. What are your thoughts on kind of where things are going to grow in this technology space? And even for maybe some of the features and aspects of the platform for Netlify?
Well, absolutely. I think, Composable is here to stay, right? It's growing really fast and for very good reason. What I think is we're going to a composable future, towards a composable future. What that means is that there's way too many tools coming out and way too many touch points for one monolith to really serve it all well, right? So I think this notion that you're going to pick and mix and match different tools and rather than buy at DXP, you're going to be building it.
Yeah.
That I very much believe in. Then I think that different layers of this stack, especially when it comes to the digital touch points, right? To the UI and the presentation layers, there we're seeing tremendous impact by things like AI, right? I think when it comes to frameworks, for example, I think AI is going to be a big part of that. I think right now you have sort of front-end code by itself and a Figma design by itself, right? I think you're going to see visual frameworks that are coming out and are going to be quite default, right? I think that whole game is going to change tremendously. I think a lot of things like personalization, experimentation is also they're very, very manual today if you look at it, right? And I think that's going to be heavily influenced by AI, right? And which is great because a lot of us know there's a lot of best practices out there that we just don't have the resources or the tooling or whatever it is to follow through on, right? And I think that's where automation is really going to help us a lot. And so I see that space developing tremendously. And then I think like this continuous of a journey for the web developer. When I mentioned earlier, right? They started out as being, developers that would cut out Photoshop file and turn it into HTML, and then they were compiling things. And now think of it, right? You use TypeScript or JavaScript on edge nodes, right? To do something that was reserved for very hardcore infrastructure engineers just a few years ago, right? And you just push it to get together with the rest of your website and you're done. And I think that journey is going to continue. We're now seeing a huge wave of backend as a service, which is essentially just pushing the need for a database even further down the line, right? And I think that's going to grow, right? And then I think this idea that we already are embracing fully is how much can we distribute to the edge locally, right? Get away from those single point of origin because they are single point of failure and bottlenecks. That's only something that's going to keep happening, right? And so I think a lot of what you do is not going from on-prem to cloud, but it's going to be distributed, right? And live many places at once. I think that's something that's very much going to continue, right? And then I think this focus, when we started out developer productivity, we couldn't even sell it, right? Even though we could show the numbers and saying, hey, that much more velocity, instead of needing 5 different types of engineers, you can have one and they can get the job done. It was still a hard sell because enterprises weren't investing in it. Since then, in the last 7 or 8 years, that has tremendously changed, right? And I think this idea of making the people you have much more efficient, so investing in their workflows, is something that we'll just see more of, right? And I hope so too, because that's the space we're in, right? But I think that's going to be a big part of this, right? So we're not just going to be talking about the components, but the interoperability, like how it all works together, and what for that marketing department or CIO or whoever sits at the end of it, what is it they need to see, right? They need to see the reports, what needs to be actionable and how, right? I think that's going to be the main focus because a lot of the rest of it is going to be automated.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Chris. And I just think that it's key that the speed to release is so critical with this because that is make or break for an organization today. And you look at the opportunity, and you mentioned it earlier, some organizations are, 15, 20 pushes a day that are happening on average. And
we have 25 a day.
25 a day. 25 a day.
Production.
To production, where back in the day, you might have one massive push once a month, if not once a quarter for an organization, because it was such a process and you have to take a site down completely. And so it's incredible to see that level of performance and that intelligence layer that you've built overall. So Chris, I appreciate you being on the show today so much. Really, just for anyone listening, if you have more questions on Composable, let us know. Send in a note. You can email us. You can post it on the comments of our different social channels, etc. Just let us know if there's another topic you'd like us to hit on as well. But overall, I just want Chris, thank you again for being on the show. Thank you everyone for tuning in and listening to Lessons for Tomorrow. For more information, check out the descriptions of this episode. And if you wouldn't mind giving us a rating and sharing this podcast with others to prepare them for the future, we'd greatly appreciate that. Don't forget to follow us on social media, where you might find me here or there. Sometimes I check in once or twice, maybe a month. And overall, this episode is brought to you by americaneagle.com studios. I'm your host, Tim Ahlenius, and I'll catch you in the next lesson.